It's my very great privilege to be able to introduce Distinguished Professor David Boud. He joins us from Deakin University, but is also affiliated with a number of international institutions. So Professor Boud is going to speak to us about, do we need assessment as we know it? I would like to hand over to David.
Thanks very much, Anne, and for kicking off this series of provocations. I'm very pleased to be here. I'm back at Wollongong. I was here for a keynote last year and a few years in the past before that, so it's a rather pleasant place to return to. I'm also rather pleased to be at the front of this rather distinguished group of people who are coming along to give these provocations. I looked at it on the web and I was kind of amazed that you managed to capture all the key people in the areas that you're concerned with there. So I think that's great. All through my career as an academic, which has been a reasonably long one up until now, I've always been bugged by assessment. Whatever my role was, and it isn't until I joined Deakin that I actually had a role that was directly about assessment, I've been disturbed. I've always been worried that back when I was a student, I didn't like assessment then. The assessment activities that I engage my students in as a teacher, I wasn't terribly convinced by. And I've dabbled with all sorts of innovations over that time, some of them quite radical, some of them quite modest. And it hasn't been until the last 10 years or so I've had a chance to reflect more broadly on what's going on in the assessment space in universities and worry about what it is that we're doing. So what I want to do to kick off is to ask ourselves the question, do we really need assessment in the way that we presently think about it? And you won't be surprised to know that my answer to that question is no, we do need to change it. So I'm exercised by this question. If assessment didn't exist, would we still need to invent it? And if we needed to invent it, would it take the form that we've inherited? Now, we've inherited it rather than designed it, is what I want to suggest. And now, with this new initiative, you actually have an opportunity to actually think very hard about what it's there to do and what it's there for. So I want to focus on the challenges for assessment design now and touch on these 8 areas in which I want to say something about each one. And each one I want to suggest is actually quite problematic. So I want to identify the problem and then identify some of the solutions or ways in which we might tackle that problem. But just to kind of get us in the frame of thinking here, I want to pose a question to you, and it's a rhetorical question. I'm not going to ask you to give your response. If the term assessment didn't exist, what would we call it? This thing that we have, this heading called assessment, what is really going on under that heading? And what is it really about? Now, I'm going to unpack that a little bit later, but I just want to get you to get into the mode of thinking about what is underneath this heading. Feedback is one of the things that comes under the heading of assessment. So it's nice to see that prompted by the technology here. Okay, just give you just a few seconds to kind of think about what is really going on when you do this thing called assessment. Well, there's all sorts of reasons. There's all sorts of answers we might give to that. Some of those are educational reasons, and some of them are reasons about something else. Because assessment isn't just something we do to our students for good educational reasons. It actually has a life in the world outside that. It's used for selection processes. It's used for rationing scarce goods. is used by all sorts of people in ways that we never dreamt of. I want to argue that assessment is whatever else it is, and I'll be explaining it. It covers a number of different things. It's essentially about making judgments about learning. It's about us making judgments about our students' learning. It's about us encouraging students to make judgments about their own learning. And it's about us going through a process of helping students get to a state that we want to be the outcome of a process of learning. So research tells us, and there's been an awful lot of research on assessment and learning over the years, awful lot. What we do know from all that research on assessment is that it has often negative effects on students' learning. It gets students to learn things which are not what we want them to learn. It often distracts their attention, and it often focuses them on things which we really wouldn't want them to do. What assessment does is it gives students a message, a very, very powerful message about what we really care about. So if we had a look at your assessment practices, would they be the most perfect representation about what you care most about in terms of your students' learning? And would they fully represent the things that you care about, that your students should learn? And when we start to test that out in real situations, we find that it's somewhat lacking. We know a lot about what needs to be done in assessment, but actually making that work, implementing that in real terms, is actually very problematic. So what I want to do is, I mentioned those 8 things at the beginning I want to focus on. For each issue, I want to identify what the problem is there and some possible solutions. And what I'd like you to focus on is, how could this be implemented in real situations without more resources? Nothing that I say will require more resources. Nothing. You might think that it does, but the question is, how do you do it without putting more effort in? Now, of course, there might be some transition time when you're moving from one thing to another, which might be a little demanding. But in the steady state, none of these will involve more effort, I would argue. And there's 2 points in which I'm going to pause for questions, and I'll take questions from the room and from online. But before we get stuck into those issues, I'd just like to rehearse what assessment is for. And I want to suggest that there are 3 purposes of assessment. Now, people divide up the cake in different ways, but this is what I find most useful. Purpose 1, it's there for assurance purposes. And this is locked up in the higher education standards. It is monitored by TEXA. And one of the reasons we do assessment is to assure that the learning outcomes which are specified for any given course, any given program, have been met. And as far as our external accountability is concerned, this is purpose number 1. It's not the only purpose, but if we don't do this, we are at risk of TEXA deregistering the university. So there's a big, big stick. The second purpose is to enable students in their learning, and it's to enable students along the pathway between where they are now and meeting the ultimate outcomes we expect of them for the particular program in which they're enrolled or the particular subject in which they're enrolled. So this is often called formative assessment, and I mentioned feedback earlier. Feedback fits in under this heading. And those 2 purposes, often called summative assessment, formative assessment, are well known. The thing that's less well known, that I would argue is just as important, is that we also need, through assessment processes, to build students' capacity to make judgments about their own learning. When a student has finished with us, when they graduate, the most important thing they need to be able to do is to know what they know and know what they don't know, to know what they can do and know what they can't do. And unless our assessment equips them to do this, rather than the opposite, which has become dependent upon us for making judgments, then whatever else we do, we've failed. So this is what we might call sustainable assessment. It's about sustaining students' learning in the longer term. If we want to look at the higher education standards, we can look at the definition here. This is what Texas says, or not Texas, this is the legislative instrument that we operate under. Methods of assessment are consistent with the learning outcomes being assessed and are capable of confirming that all specified learning outcomes are achieved. Who can put their hand on their heart and say that that's what we do right now? I would suggest that we fail in meeting one of the higher education standards right now. And maybe we should be focused on doing something about that. Okay, the starting point I want to make is a lot of what we're doing is based upon learning outcomes. Now, when they were first introduced, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago, whatever it was, we regarded it as a bit of an administrative impost. Who are these people asking us to write down what the learning outcomes are for our courses? And we tended to kind of just fill in a form and said, this is what they are. These were pretty awful because we were doing it for reasons of compliance. We were doing it in order to satisfy someone in the administration. Now, most of us, in most of our institutions, have been through this cycle of rewriting learning outcomes many times now. And there's starting to be a reasonable approximation of what the students should be able to do. We advertise the learning outcomes for a course, and these are what are accredited. But when we assess within subjects, and we don't assess in terms of the program learning outcomes. And what happens is that when we do a little bit of mapping, we find that some of the program or course learning outcomes are incredibly well assessed, and we actually find other ones are not assessed at all. We also find, because of the way in which we record our assessment, like we record it by task, we have a test or an exam or an assignment, and we weight each other, we give grades for each other, and we average those grades to create a grade for a subject. What we're doing is that we are eliminating information about learning outcomes. This common everyday practice that we engage in destroys information about students' performance against learning outcomes. And worse than that, we allow students who have not attained the necessary standard in one learning outcome to pass because they did better in a completely different learning outcome. And it just so happened that this assessment task assessed more than one outcome, and students could actually fudge the system. Now, the students are not fudging the system, we are fudging the system. We are actually creating a problem that shouldn't be there. Also, at the moment, we report assessment information by subject. I think you call them subjects. Other people call them units, other people call them modules. And we don't report by learning outcome. If it's the learning outcomes that we're accountable for, how come the transcript that we produce on a student's graduation doesn't list learning outcomes and performance against each one? Why does it list subjects? And why does it list grades that deliberately and consciously destroy information about students' learning outcomes? This is bizarre behaviour, quite bizarre behaviour, but we regard it as completely normal. So, what is the solution to this problem? Well, first of all, is to have meaningful learning outcomes. And by and large, we're moving quite well in that direction. Now, a few more iterations might be needed, but we're kind of on the right path there. The other thing we need to do is this issue of assurance. If you looked at that higher education standard from the earlier slide. It requires us to assure that all students have met all learning outcomes to a threshold standard. So do we know what that threshold standard is for a given learning outcome? How do we represent that standard? How come we talk about pass marks without linking the pass to a particular standard? We kind of arbitrarily say, well, there's a pass mark here, which we create by averaging other things, and we've eliminated all information about students' performance against learning outcomes. So maybe we need to say, well, we can't aggregate marks across different learning outcomes. Maybe we could aggregate them within a learning outcome. Maybe. And maybe we need to record our results by students' performance against outcome, as distinct from performance against a subject. We also need to know now, in the context of the AI challenge, what should be a legitimate learning outcome. Should we be specifying the conditions under which a learning outcome has been achieved, with or without AI? Maybe that's a meaningful direction we might need to go in. And again, should we radically change learning outcomes if some of them can be met by AI without learning occurring? Because we're not assessing AI here, we're assessing students' learning outcomes. And we're in a very challenging situation at the moment because probably all of our graduates, in almost every occupation that they're going into, will have the affordances of AI in the future. So does it make sense for us to assess them independently of the normal aids that we have at the moment? I mean, would we want to go back to situations in which we assess students without access to word processing? In some situations, we do that. We bizarrely deny the fact that there's been a revolution of IT and all these people sitting there have got their laptops in front of them. We say, oh, no, if it's a proper assessment, you've got to use a pen. Right? You know, we've got to get back to old technology. Why don't we ask them to write with quills? Yeah. Why not? Yeah. This is the situation we find ourselves in at the moment. So that's a challenge about learning outcomes. Yes. Now, the other thing is, second provocation is about assessment. Assessment, I've got it here, is locked up in units, locked up in subjects in your context. So where does assessment sit? Well, it sits within the subject that you teach. And by and large, assessment is governed by what you choose to assess within that particular subject. Now, in some professional areas, there's a bit more negotiation involved, but by and large, you're the assessor as well as the teacher. And as I mentioned before, what we find is that if we look at the overall program learning outcomes, course learning outcomes, some of them are over-assessed, some of them are under-assessed. And some of the most important ones aren't assessed at all. I've been through these curriculum mapping exercises in a number of different universities and a number of different faculties, and it's shocking. It's very good to do this with all the people responsible for a course in the same room together, so they can see the horrors of what their course does and doesn't do. And of course, the other thing is that the way we structure things at the moment, we structure things in such a way that it's the person that teaches the subject that's responsible for the assessment. There isn't anyone directly with real accountability that looks across the whole program. I mean, you do have program leaders or whatever the name is you call them here, You do have those people, but by and large, they don't have the authority and they don't have the recognition to do things about assessment across the program. So what we're doing is that we're locking up assessment within subjects. And of course, the professional bodies are very concerned about this. And some of the professional bodies have actually taken a lot of steps to do something. In medicine, it's happening. In engineering, Engineers Australia is just in the process of rolling out a whole lot of engineering mindsets. And these are key ways of thinking and doing that all engineers need. And when you look at the engineering mindset that the professional body wants, and then you look at the assessment that occurs in engineering, the gap is a chasm. So that's the problem. The solution: we see assessment for assurance as locked up, is accepted as a responsibility for the program. So this means that we need to talk to each other a lot more than we do at the moment, and actually have arrangements whereby we agree on what the assessment for a course or a program is. And instead of our normal habit of we have a program, it gets accredited, then we hand out the bits of the program to various people and basically say, oh, get on with it, you can look after that. We actually need to make some agreement about what assessment is. And assessment doesn't necessarily need to sit within subjects. Formative assessment might sit there because it's so closely connected with teaching. But do we want to go beyond that? And I've got these characters up here as their key players in what is called programmatic assessment. And programmatic assessment, or course-wide assessment, is a strategy to unlock assessment from individual subjects and put it in as a program level responsibility. And I didn't know this before I drew up the slide, but two of the three people up here are going to be giving provocations later in this series. Elizabeth Bartman from Utrecht at the top. Kees van der Vleuten from Maastricht is the one in the middle. He won't be coming here. And Lambert Shawworth. He's not pronounced Shawworth, but I never know how to pronounce it. From Flinders, and he's involved in this new medical school that they're setting up. He's going to be here later. So what we're doing is that we're moving assessment as being locked up in units and say, well, some of that needs to occur in a way that there's more collective responsibility for it, rather than based upon the idiosyncrasies of whoever is teaching or whoever is responsible for teaching a particular subject. Oh, this is the only other picture I've got here. I'm not going to put pictures up for all these slides. And whenever I do a presentation using this picture, I ask people, who is this person? And I've never yet been in a situation where anyone can name this person. This person is Sir Philip Hartog. And in 1931, which is nearly 100 years ago, he actually wrote a report for the British government on holistic versus analytic marking. And one of the things that he identified was basically you can't assess things to the degree of accuracy that the marks seem to suggest. Surprise, surprise. Now, this is not a startling finding. One of the things that all our students learn if they're doing science or engineering or any one of those measurement areas in their first year is that we teach them, do not report information to a finer degree of accuracy than the measurement allows. So if this is the case, why ever are we ever reporting things to percentage accuracy? This is complete nonsense, completely unjustified. We can never decide on whether somebody's met a learning outcome to that precision. And if we go back to the work of Hartog and Rhodes back then, it's hard to justify giving almost any assessment in a finer degree of granularity than the common 4 passing grades that we typically use in Australia. High distinction, distinction, credit, pass. Anything finer than that, forget about pluses and minuses. Right? Forget about that. Not justifiable by the accuracy of measurement. So why are we obsessed? Not in every area. Some areas are exempt from this because they're cluey or, it's just following another tradition. Why do we actually focus on this degree of accuracy which is not sustainable? So, the solution is one of the easiest ones here. This is probably one of the easiest provocation to deal with. We never report marks or grades more accurately than the measurement allows. And let's not pretend, because we give a 100-item test, we can, if we want to, report, 76%. But this is misunderstanding what a test does. That's not a test of the learning outcome. That's a test of the particular items you've chosen to put in a particular test. So we need to set that aside. And in terms of learning outcomes, we can't be more accurate. So maximum number of passing grades, 4 or less. 4 is generous. Yeah? There's another reading of the data that says 4 is too many. We don't allow averaging across outcomes. And we actually need a bit of a campaign, both amongst ourselves and amongst our students, to explain accuracy. Any student that comes along and asks you, why have I got 76 for this rather than 78? Why are we putting ourselves in the situation in which students ask us stupid questions? Because that's what we're doing. That's a stupid question. There is no difference between a 76 and 78. None whatsoever. Why are we pretending otherwise by telling students they've got one rather than the other? And so this leads some people to think about, should we abolish grades altogether? This is a much more controversial thing, but it is also starting to take root. And the question is, do all our subjects need to be graded? Now, if we're obsessed with grade point averages, which I've just discussed are fairly absurd, then maybe we do. Because if we have a mixture of graded and ungraded courses, students are going to miss out. Okay? But if we're not bothered by that, if we're averaging across outcomes or reporting by outcomes, then maybe we don't need grades as much as we do at the moment. And the other thing that grades do is that it focuses our attention on the grade level distinctions. Think of all the discussions we've had about, is this a D or a credit? Yeah. Well, that's maybe not what we should be focusing on. If we go back to the higher education standards, we should be asking ourselves, has every single student in this class met the threshold minimum standard to pass this particular learning outcome? So that's the direction of focus that we need to be thinking about. So I'm going to have a pause now, take any questions, and I'll just take one from the floor and one from online. Yes, question from the room.
My name is Sibylle Schwab. I'm just wondering what you said, like the last thing about the grades and the granularity of grades, and I completely agree with that. I would say it's not possible to go more than 4 grades. However, when we go to school systems and when we go into university and into programs, this is where people are fighting for every single mark. So I would want to know about what is the implication of if we would say, well, if we just go for achieve your learning outcomes, which is what we want to have with university students. But how do we then go into things like making programs or these highly sought after programs? How do we manage these processes?
Yeah. One of the questions we have to ask ourselves is, what is our responsibility, and then what is the responsibility of other people? I remember the discussion very well in New South Wales when in the higher school certificate. Now, the State Education Department, who is responsible for higher school certificate, produces an output that doesn't involve a number. But the universities wouldn't buy that. They said, we need a number on which basis to select our students. So this is where this average score from schooling came from. And when we say, who's obsessed with grades? Oh, our students are obsessed with grades. No, we're obsessed with grades. Collectively and institutionally, it's us that is pushing towards grades for selection purposes. Now, that, in a sense, is outside our present debate about selecting people for university, but it is within our control to select people for scholarships or for higher degrees and so on. And I have to report, when I moved to UTS, I moved to UTS as a head of school and a professor of adult education there. And I moved to a school that had no grades in any subject whatsoever. And we were continually under pressure from the rest of the university, not from our students, from the rest of the university, to have grades. And we successfully managed to get our students into selective programs, into PhD programs, and so on and so forth. But it was the obsession of the rest of the university about grades that was the problem. So let's not blame students for obsessions about grading. We are obsessed with it ourselves. The story finishes rather ironically, in that I went on sabbatical, and whilst I was on sabbatical, the academic board passed a motion enforcing grades upon the school that I headed. So let's be careful about what we're thinking is most important and for whom. So yes, it does make selection more difficult. But for example, I'm in the process of selecting PhD students at the moment, and they've all got grade point averages and information like that. If I relied upon looking at their grades, I wouldn't get anywhere. I'd select hopeless PhD students. So we need to look at a whole range of other things. And it's not our responsibility to do the selection of employers for them. Basically, employers are rather they're not very enamoured about what we do with our grades at the moment. I ran a focus group for major employers at Deakin last year, and I asked them, what did they look at when they saw a student's transcript? And only one of this whole range of employers said they looked at the grades. One. It's a law firm, by the way. So fulfilled my prejudices about law. So let's not pretend that we're doing it for some other people. All the people that are obsessed with grades are within the education system, and primarily they're all within universities. So we need to look to ourselves, I think. Is there an online question? Oh, up there. I'm only going to take the top one. So we can uprate if you're online. So if you've got a computer, you can go into the online version and ask your questions or uprate them there. How do we convince the powers to be to let us get experimental and focus on the learning? Well, let's not talk about being experimental. Let's just talk about focusing on the learning. Focus on learning, focus on assurance of learning. Powers that be are very, very happy with that because they're accountable for making assurance work. So I'm optimistic that many of these ideas are taking root in universities, much more so now than at any other point in history. What is not happening is widespread wholesale adoption across whole institutions. But every single university I know, I could dip into and find good people doing good things. And what this development relies upon is us being good people doing good things, and our colleagues will be dragged along in the process. Some of them might make a fuss on the way through, but that won't be for long. Is there any more in the room? Okay, I'll take the next one online. Please elaborate on the similarities and differences between what you just outlined and competency-based education. What I've been talking about is the system we've been operating under for many, many years, and it is a standards-based system. It's an outcome-based. Other countries use the word outcomes-based system. So if you go to Hong Kong, it's an outcomes-based system. They're all more or less the same, and they privilege the notion of identifying what a student should be able to do when they graduate and actually assessing that. In the VET sector, the vocational education and training sector, there is competency-based education. And by and large, competencies are finer-grained versions of learning outcomes. There was a big battle 20 years ago, 25 years ago, I can't remember exactly when, in which the government of the day wanted both universities and the vocational education training sector to have a common view about assessment. And they were promoting competency-based education. This got taken up in the VET sector because the VET sector was directly controlled by, well, state departments, basically. It didn't get taken up in the university sector because, led by the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Melbourne, there was a sort of steadfast argument, no, we're not going to go down there. We want something more holistic. And that's why we ended up with the learning outcomes rather than the competency-based view at the moment. So a learning outcome doesn't have the degree of granularity that a competency would have. And I'm going to move on now. We might hold other questions. If some of these get uprated, then we can come back to them later. Okay, next item is assessment doesn't portray what students can do. And I partly covered this already. So transcripts aggregate results by subject, and these are an abstract code. We're basically taking useful information about students and encrypting it in a way that doesn't allow anyone to understand what it means. The only people that might even have a glimpse of what it means are the people who actually taught that particular subject. Almost no one else has the faintest clue about what a particular grade on a transcript means. And we can't go backwards. And as I mentioned before, employers tend to increasingly ignore them. So, one simple thing we can do, well, it's simple conceptually, and it's relatively simple for us to do, is to aggregate results by learning outcomes, course learning outcomes. We can also have transcripts which take the form of validated digital credentials. And what happens here is that you can actually click on a particular outcome. An employer or anyone can click on an outcome, and it tells you what it was that the students was able to do that enabled that outcome to be satisfied, and the conditions under which it was satisfied. And indeed, you can add extra things as well. You can even say who actually was the person finally making the judgment about that particular learning outcome. All this technology is available right now. Nothing new needs to exist. The main stumbling block is our student record keeping systems in the university. And I've been banging on over many years now to the previous Deputy Vice-Chancellor and the previous Deputy Vice-Chancellor at Deakin, and they say, absolutely, this is what we must do. We must go down this path. But we don't have $10 million available right now to change our student record keeping system. So this is a very good example of something that can be fixed relatively easy when we are changing our student record system. And we can't afford to do it unless we're changing it for some other reason, because it's expensive. But can I put the marker down? Next time this comes up for review, make sure you get this requirement fixed in the system, because if it's not fixed, it's continually pushing us back on this rather unhelpful way of recorded student achievements. The other thing I've added here, which I think is a bit of a sleeper, many students at the moment decide to curate their own representation of their performance. I mean, this is all over the internet. There's all sorts of devices, strategies to do this. And one of the things that's missing from this is the ability for them to take something which is officially recognised by the university as authoritatively making a statement about their achievement that they can include in their curated performance. They can bung in their transcript, but this is not meaningful. It doesn't tell anyone anything. So we need this information for our students to portray to employers, to people that are going to give them scholarships, what it is that they're able to do. Exemplars of their achievements in meaningful terms that anyone can understand. Unlike the grade against the subject that no one can understand. I remember I put up a transcript with this group of employers, and the main thing they were asking, what does that mean? What's that subject mean? I haven't got the faintest idea what that refers to. Number 5 is that somehow, inadvertently, we positioned our students to become overly dependent upon us. And this is not what a university is about. We should have students, when they graduate, they should be able to, as I said before, know what they know what they can do, know what they don't know what they aren't able to do. So our present assessment systems, the formal part of it, position students as looking to us to judge them. And maybe we need to turn that around. Maybe we need to say to students, well, the most important thing for you as a learner is for you to be able to judge your own performance. Now, you may want us to confirm that by our assessment. That's fair enough. You might want us to help you calibrate your own judgments, and that's fair enough. But why should we always make the assumption that we should be always doing the assessment? Why are we not putting students in the situation in which they make assessments and then we write a commentary on their assessments? This is something that I was doing with my students 25 years ago. So when they actually produced their work, they produced their work with some self-assessment representation. What were the criteria they used? What were their judgments about their own work with respect to these criteria? And my comments on the students' work were a commentary on their judgments, not on the absolute performance of their work. So if they'd have done well and they could identify they'd done well on a particular item, if they'd done badly and they knew why they'd done badly, I really didn't need to say anything else other than I agree. What the students most needed from me in terms of assessment is drawing their attention to the discrepancies between their judgment and the judgment that any reasonable person would make about the work that they've produced. This is very helpful for their student learning. Just getting a mark on its own isn't quite enough. And we need to think in terms of what we're calling this currently is the development of students' evaluative judgment. It's a kind of it's evolved from the idea of student self-assessment, but student self-assessment kind of positions it too much in the assessment territory, whereas developing students' evaluative judgment places it much more clearly in the learning territory. So I've already kind of talked ahead here. So we need to think in terms of normal business in our course. Normal business in our course is there's lots of opportunities for students to self-assess and for them to get peer feedback on their work. And peer feedback is an interesting one because What we know about peer feedback is it isn't necessarily the quality of what the receiver gets. Most of the learning occurs from the person providing the information, because to provide peer feedback to another person, you have to understand what you're talking about. You have to articulate it in terms that the other person understands. So peer feedback is a way of rehearsing your understanding. So there is a bit of the research shows there's benefit both ways. So I talked about introducing these activities throughout normal courses, and to focus our comments on the quality of student judgments and not just have they got it right or not. The most important thing is, are they able to distinguish whether they've got it right or not? Do they know the difference between good and better work? This is very helpful information for their learning. Number 6 is about inclusion. But I want to take inclusion a bit further than the normal discussions we have. I don't know what it's like at Wollongong, but Deakin and other universities I know, the number of students applying for special consideration is going up and up and up. And it's becoming unbelievably burdensome. So what do we do? Do we actually have a whole parallel assessment system to assess students who apply for special consideration? The problem with special consideration is that you have to declare. You have to declare some deficiency, right, about yourself that provides an argument of saying why I want to be assessed differently than other students. This is a big barrier. And it's okay if you're in a wheelchair. I mean, you're used to being in a wheelchair and everyone knows you're in a wheelchair. But there's all sorts of other conditions that are not visible. And this is where the stigma comes in. The other thing is that we normally have a sort of set of categories for special consideration. In fact, some of the categories are determined by law that we need to take into account. But there's a whole range of other things that aren't covered by that. The whole neurodiversity issue is not covered by any of those laws that we have. So often students don't disclose an issue. Often they don't know that special consideration is available to them, because when it's advertised, there's a kind of list of categories to illustrate. And if you're not in one of those categories, think, well, this is not for me. And the other thing is that this is not just about disability. Disability is absolutely one of those areas. But there's all sorts of things about social capital, say. Are we actually organising our assessments so that students with high levels of social capital do much better than those students that don't? Is this an issue? It might be. So that we have assessments usually designed to fit an advantage norm. And you see the little cartoon there. Because you give every person the same assessment task, this makes it fair. Well, this shows you how silly that argument is. The strategy is clear. Doing it is more challenging. The strategy is we design assessments to be inclusive from the start. We don't design an assessment so that it works for able-bodied, advantaged men in some cases, or in high levels of society to do well on, and others not. We still need to be mindful of the learning outcomes, because these represent what students need to be able to achieve no matter what their disability is. So they've still got to meet the learning outcomes, but do they need assessment in the way that we presently know it? So maybe we only restrict what we assess by the requirement that we assure the non-negotiable learning outcomes. And does that mean that all our learning outcomes are required. Maybe we need to be thinking about optional learning outcomes that a student can add to their course. If they do that, then we're not obliged to assure it in Texas terms. So we need to think quite carefully, I think, about the possibilities that this creates. So, for example, because we've had very stereotyped forms of assessment in the past, like the formal examination. The formal examination is time limited. The formal examination doesn't allow you to take anything into the room. The formal examination requires you to write with a pen. So there's all sorts of kind of fairly arbitrary limits on it, each one of which rules out certain kinds of students. So we need to think about, are there assessments that don't necessarily up front rule people out? Can we design assessment tasks that are much more inclusive and to include a much wider range of considerations than we normally think about? So, another pause for questions.
I really liked your slide on the developing self-evaluative judgment. I think that's hugely important, and I was wanting to get your take on this, particularly in an AI world where students are using AI to generate their assessment and then using AI to evaluate that assessment. So what they believe self-evaluation is asking AI to tell them how good their work is. How do you see us being able to develop self-evaluative judgment in students when AI is so pervasive?
Well, I mean, the way in, the back door, as it were, is that they need to be able to make judgments about AI's output. And this is exactly the same skill they need to judge their own work. So we need to be given them practice in activities. I mean, for example, a colleague overseas had this assignment whereby he gives the student an assignment, and instead of asking the students to complete the assignment, he asked the students to put it into Gen AI. And Gen AI produced the assignment. But the substantial assessment is the students' critique of AI and their analysis of why it's not working very well.
But how does the teacher know that that hasn't also been generated by AI?
Well, this is the dilemma with AI. So you can actually do these. But I think that the point I'm making is that the skill that a student needs to judge their own work, the skill they need to judge the work of other people, the skill they need to judge the outputs of AI is the same skill. And whatever else we're doing, we need to give students lots of practice. And in the AI world, the importance of that self-assessment skill has gone up by leaps and bounds. Of course, as you pointed out, there's another issue that needs to be addressed if we're looking at assessment for assurance purposes. But if we're looking for learning, then that's one of the ways in.
I'm really interested in what you said around designing inclusive assessment. When I finished the HSC back in Year 12, I thought I was going to single-handedly remove the HSC requirement because I just thought, I was just so traumatised by it. But then now I'm so entrenched in wanting assessment, and I disclose that I'm from law. And so we do pay, I know that employees pay a lot of attention to marks. But my question is how, have you worked with an example of an assessment task that has been designed to be inclusive? Is there an example that we could provide? But then, a sub-question based on what you said, Monty, is that when you raise the question of if AI can evaluate, I think, in that instance, in that example that you provided, let's do the evaluation in the room. So then we can make sure that the AI didn't evaluate and that we've done that before in some of our subjects. But if we're doing the evaluation in the room, it raises inclusivity questions because more and more students are not wanting to participate in that live discussion for reasons of inclusivity. So we're kind of going around full circle in what do we do here?
Can I just generalise an example of that first thing that you raised, and that is how do we get an inclusive assessment task? I think that's a summary of what you were asking, is it? Yeah. I think the starting point is one, what is our existing assessment task? And are we completely convinced this enables us to judge whether a student has addressed a non-negotiable learning outcome? That's one. We then take that existing assessment task and we then start to deconstruct it in terms of imagining all the variety of students that might be facing that task, and how might students with a different disability, with a different background, tackle that task, and is it fair for all of them? And then we rework the task, and it's not just necessarily the task itself. It might be the question, but more importantly, it might be the circumstances under which we pose that question. So, for example, do we set a time limit? Do we set a limit on what mode the student answers the question? Do we actually ask ourselves, is this question over-specified? Is there an equivalent way of framing this so that a student can show that they've met the learning outcome by doing something different from the task that we've posed? So the range of ways of doing it are actually quite diverse. And often the starting point is, are we more or less satisfied that the present assessment task meets addressing the assurance of the learning outcome? If the answer is yes, we go down this other path. We don't need to go down that other path if the present assessment task isn't addressing those learning outcomes. Academics don't even know how to write proper learning objectives or assessments to assess learning objectives. Any thoughts on how to make teaching and learning a priority? Well, it's called practice, actually called practice, that we get better at writing learning outcomes and we get better at writing assessment tasks by doing it and getting comments from our peers about, is this good enough? So we do need the process that is very well established in other areas of assessment. In writable multiple choice questions, it's been established for 50 years, 60, 70 years maybe, that the way you write good multiple choice questions is that you come up with a proposal and you go to a shredding session in which you put that in front of other people and they shred your item to pieces, right? And you actually never ever produce a multiple choice question unless it's already been shredded. So I think we need to be thinking about shredding in the context of normal assessment. So we have a situation at the moment where we just kind of have got this terrible laissez-faire attitude that we can come up with more or less whatever assessment items we like. But this is just too weirdly idiosyncratic. You know, if we're in a system in which we want students to achieve something, shouldn't we more collectively look at our assessment items to see what they can and cannot do and how can we improve them in that process? So I think the answer is yes, a lot of us do need practice in improving the quality of writing, learning outcomes and assessment items. But the way we do it is just by doing it. We're doing it and we iterate. And we expose it to other people and we iterate again. Now, we don't need to do that all the time for everything, but the exercise of going through that iterative shredding process really starts to build our capacity to actually write good outcomes and write good assessment designs. This is about feedback. There's been an awful lot done on feedback in the last 10 years. It's fair to say there's been a revolution in our thinking about feedback. If you haven't come across ideas about feedback in the last decade, then it's really worth dipping your toe into this area. What we have is a very strange practice that if we did it anywhere else, it would be regarded as offensive. Okay? So some person that you hardly know comes up to you and gives you unsolicited information about your performance. Are you delighted by this? No, you're not. This is awful, right? What gives you a right to kind of tell me what to do? But we've institutionalised this as a normal everyday practice. So we need to think a lot more about how we need to do feedback in a way that is, well, first of all, that treats students as normal human beings, for a start, but also enables them to warrant what we're doing. We've also got this problem about the amount of feedback we can provide is actually incredibly limited. You know, we've got the limit of the semester, and how many feedback cycles can we fit into that? Well, not that many. The other thing is that we think about feedback in the wrong way. We think about feedback in terms of how long from the time when students handed in the work do they get something back from us. This is stupid, right? The issue is feedback in terms of timing is how far ahead of the next task do they receive the information on the previous task and do have the opportunity to actually do something with it. So we need to actually rethink a lot of the taken for granted things that we have about feedback. So we see it as a teacher responsibility. Our student surveys actually position it as something that teachers do on students. We subject our students to feedback. All the current thinking over the last 10 years or so is about seeing it as a learning-centred process, not a teaching-centred process. And also the other student thing is students are worried about peer feedback because of these issues of collusion. So what we might do, we need to build students' feedback literacy. And what I mean by feedback literacy is what knowledge and skills the students need to have about how feedback works to improve learning. And for example, one of the things that we might do is that we don't start a feedback loop by giving students this information. We start the loop by asking the students what information from us would they find helpful. This is the simplest thing you could possibly do. Right, there's a cover sheet for an assignment, there's a little box on it, students write in, I'd particularly like you to comment on this. How much effort does that take you? 0 effort. And what it does is that it means when you do give comments to students, whatever else you might say, it doesn't limit you saying all sorts of things. It means that whatever else you're doing, you're actually buying in to the student's need. And students love this. You're showing that you respect them and you respect what they care about. So let's think again about how we do feedback. Final thing is about validity. I think by this stage it should be obvious that my view is that most of our assessment methods don't enable us to judge what a student can and cannot do. Some of them do. Some in practical situations, in nursing or whatever, you know, you can tell whether the student can correctly take blood pressure or whatever. And the other problem with Gen AI, of course, is that it obscures us knowing whether a student can or cannot do something. We don't know whether they can do it aided or unaided. And this is a real challenge. And of course, what happens also, which is a validity issue, is that we blame students for cheating when we've set up assessments to encourage it. Right? If a student doesn't think an assessment is valid, that is it really getting at what is important in my learning? Then we've kind of broken the contract with them. We've kind of cheated. We've cheated them by having a bad assessment practice. So why should we be surprised if then students want to cheat back? So we need to think a lot about what validity is, and we need to increase our focus on validity in order to do many things. So, some solutions. We have assessments which indicate progress towards assuring that learning outcomes have been met by all students. So students know that the assessment is helping them judge whether they're on the path of meeting the final outcome. We prioritise validity over cheating because invalid assessments demonstrate to students our lack of integrity. So we're obsessed with their integrity. But why do we model bad integrity? By having bad assessment items, invalid assessment items. We need to recognise the circumstances in which graduates normally perform a task. So we need to be kind of saying, well, in the world, what would somebody do with this? And maybe that's the kind of task we need to have within the university. We can't directly translate because in the world these tasks are kind of mixed up with all sorts of other conditions. But that's something to give us a stimulation. And of course we need to identify these conditions. Now we need to find conditions under which it's legitimate for students to use or not use Gen AI. So I'm just going to go straight through challenges to be overcome, and then I'll go back to more questions. The main challenge we've got is that we've got a whole lot of habits about assessment, and these habits are embedded in our disciplines because different disciplines have different bad habits. Bad habits are not the same everywhere. They kind of have got various characteristics. So we need to think about, can we really justify the way we've been doing things? And what is it that we really need to change in this area? As I mentioned before, we need to look at these legacy record-keeping systems and have a little lobby to say to the university, next time it's up for renewal, we're going to change it so it's sensible and actually records things worth recording. We're in the process of doing that at the moment. We're just commissioning a new one, so I've got my fingers crossed on that. And the other good thing is as soon as one university develops one of these, it's easier for the next university to pick it up. We need to kind of position students as much more active, not just active in class activities, but active in their own assessment. So they're players in their own education. And I've given a number of examples of how we do this. And of course, finally, we've got this disruption of AI. We do not know where it's going to land. At the moment, we know AI does things badly. It hallucinates, it gives false references. But in later versions, referencing is getting better. Different versions of AI are better at doing some things than others. The better versions of AI cost money. Do we want to privilege students that are going to fork out? There's an equity issue here in AI about which version of AI do they use. And we've got the whole issue of students uploading not just their own information, but intellectual property of the university into the whole web, or not into the web, but into the private pockets of multinational companies. So a lot of things we need to think about here. And the final slide, do we need assessment as we now know it? And the answer is no, we've been neglecting it for too long. AI has come along, and it's come along in a very helpful manner to actually point out all the things we should have been addressing anyway. Almost nothing that I've said today is about AI exclusively. There are things that we need to fix because we need to fix them. So, AI might be the disruptor that we're facing at the moment, but we need to be disruptive in order to focus on assessment well. Thank you. Have we got time for a few more quick questions? Yeah.
I'm a student, so I'm a student of law and liberal arts, and I was really interested in the student feedback loops because they're two very different subjects. One discourages like law, discourages, I guess, participation between students in sharing their assignments, talking about the assignments, because of the fear of collusion and, you know, what's not. Whether for my liberal arts degree, we're encouraged before our assignments to share them and mark them and discuss, you know, things that are wrong with them, things we can improve. And I can tell you, like, from a personal perspective, doing the feedback process and the skills involved in that is so helpful to improving, but also knowing what you're doing wrong and what you're missing out on, which goes to the learning objectives as well. So yeah, I was really interested in that and I really appreciate that.
When staff put the fear of God into students about collusion, and the way they represented it appears to be any form of discussing my work with anyone else is kind of, you know, bad. What they're doing is that they're inhibiting learning. They're inhibiting normal, everyday learning practices. The way people learn in the world is that they actually collaborate, they talk to each other, they find out what each other's doing, they share information. So for me, the fact that people are putting these scare stories around about collusion means that they have no confidence in their own assessment practices. So I know what side of your two examples I come down on. Yeah, one there, and then we'll just go one more online.
I'd like to have you view, you're British. You know that we have got the Common European Framework Reference for Languages. For colleagues who don't know, this is, it has established what you need to achieve by different levels. So when you're a beginner, when you're intermediate level and advanced level, do you think that this is a good way of assessing? Because students can assess their own level by what they can do. What it doesn't say is to what extent you can do it well or not well, but at least they are able to tick and say what they can do. I'd like to have your view, please. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds to be a reasonable... So, I mean, as long as it's not the exclusive process, then yes. I mean, the more that we can enable students to make judgments about their own progress and their own meeting of standards, what that does is it focuses their attention not just on their performance, but on what the nature of the standard is. See, one of the things I think we need to focus on a lot more in student work is not the grade, but what constitutes good work. So what I like to do with my students is I said, I don't want to talk about grades with you. I'd like them to go away in some cases, but I'm not going to talk to you about grades. I'm going to want to talk to you about standards, and I want you to be able to identify what constitutes good work. Because unless you can identify what constitutes good work, you can't produce good work. And this, what you're describing is a kind of scaffolding process that could potentially help that. Group assessments is an interesting one. When I was at UTS, maybe, I don't know, 15 years ago, there's a big study across the whole university of what students liked and didn't like about the university. What was the number one hate across the whole university? Group assignments. And, well, we did a lot of work to try to fix that. But by and large, group assignments are one of the things that we do so badly, it's no wonder the students hate them. There's nothing intrinsically bad about group assignments. What's bad is that, one, we don't prepare students for them. One, we don't develop their skills to how to operate collectively with other people. Two, we allow students to freeload, and we actually don't think of strategies to avoid that. So my answer to this is about it's gone now. Is about group assignments. No, the focus on learning outcomes doesn't mean to say they're out, but we need to think very carefully on what doing a group assignment well looks like. I'll give you an interesting example here. Colleague in physiotherapy, they assess students in groups. So they might have 4 or 5 students, and they're performing various procedures on each other as patients. And they have to kind of show that they can do a certain thing well. I'm no physiotherapist, so I can't actually use the right words about the procedures they were using. But the form of assessment was the teacher came along and asked one of the group to answer the question. And everyone got the same as what that person answered. So what did it do? What did it do? It encouraged students to really work together, to really cooperate, because they didn't know if it was the weakest person in the group was going to get to answer the question or the strongest person. So this was an example of a group assessment that was actually a very, very positive backwash effect on learning. So we need to think about these kind of processes. Yeah. So some group assignments are pretty terrible. Like, well, let's stamp them out. But let's not throw the baby out with the bathwater, because we want students to be able to collaborate with other people to produce good work. So how do we do that, and how do we assess it? And most of the problems are inadequate preparation for students to do that. So thank you.